Alexander Sterling was one of the most feared and respected billionaires in America, controlling a vast business empire worth $6.3 billion from his glass tower in downtown Chicago. At 62, he was known throughout the corporate world as a man who showed no mercy to competitors, crushed small businesses without a second thought, and fired employees with the cold efficiency of a machine. His reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. Board meetings trembled at his approach, and entire industries shifted when he made strategic moves. Alexander had built his fortune through hostile takeovers, real estate manipulation, and a philosophy that weakness was a disease to be eliminated from his companies. He wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than most people's cars, traveled in bulletproof limousines, and lived in a penthouse that overlooked the city he had helped shape through sheer force of will and unlimited capital. His personal life was as cold and calculated as his business dealings. 3 failed marriages had taught him that emotional attachments were liabilities, and he had no children, no close friends, and no interests beyond the accumulation of wealth and power. Alexander's daily routine was precise and unchanging. Wake at 4 a.m., exercise for exactly 1 hour, review financial reports during breakfast, and spend the next 14 hours making decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever considering the human cost. His employees knew better than to approach him with personal problems. His assistants were replaced regularly when they showed signs of emotional attachment to their work, and his security team maintained a careful distance between Alexander and the ordinary people whose lives he controlled from his ivory tower. The irony was that Alexander Sterling, who controlled more resources than some small countries, was completely isolated from any meaningful human connection, living in a world where money was the only language that mattered, and compassion was seen as a weakness that could destroy everything he had built. In Chapter 2, The Unexpected Vulnerability. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in August, Alexander was walking from his downtown office to a high-stakes business meeting that could potentially add another $500 million to his portfolio. He rarely walked anywhere, preferring the security and status of his armored vehicle, but the meeting location was only 3 blocks away, and Chicago traffic was particularly heavy that day. As he strode down the sidewalk with his usual commanding presence, checking his phone for last-minute updates on stock prices and merger documents, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a strange dizziness that made the world around him seem to tilt and blur. At first, he attributed the sensation to stress or perhaps dehydration from his intense morning workout, but within seconds, the feeling intensified into something far more serious. His chest began to tighten with a pain that shot down his left arm, and his breathing became shallow and labored. Alexander Sterling, who had never shown weakness in front of anyone, suddenly found himself struggling to remain upright on a busy Chicago sidewalk. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who controlled billions of dollars and wielded immense power over thousands of people was being brought to his knees by his own cardiovascular system. As the heart attack progressed, Alexander's vision began to tunnel and his legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed onto the concrete sidewalk in his expensive suit, his phone skittering across the pavement as concerned pedestrians began to notice the well-dressed man lying motionless near the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Monroe Street. For a few crucial seconds, Alexander remained conscious enough to observe the reactions of the people around him. Most passers-by hurried past without stopping, assuming he was either drunk or homeless, despite his obviously expensive clothing. Others pulled out phones to record the scene rather than offer assistance. A few stopped to stare, but seemed uncertain about whether to get involved with someone who might be dangerous or litigious. In those terrifying moments when his life hung in the balance, Alexander Sterling discovered that his wealth, power, and fearsome reputation meant absolutely nothing when he was vulnerable and in desperate need of human compassion. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Hero. Among the crowd of indifferent adults who either ignored Alexander's collapse or treated it as entertainment for their social media feeds, one person responded with immediate and decisive action. Miguel Santos was a 12-year-old boy who had been walking home from his summer job at a local grocery store, where he bagged groceries and helped elderly customers carry their purchases to their cars. Miguel lived with his grandmother in a small apartment 6 blocks away, and his daily walk took him past the busy intersection where Alexander had collapsed. Unlike the adults who hesitated or ignored the situation entirely, Miguel didn't waste time analyzing the social or legal implications of helping a stranger in distress. He had been raised by his grandmother, Maria Santos, who had immigrated from Mexico 40 years earlier and had instilled in him the values of compassion, community responsibility, and the moral obligation to help others regardless of their background or circumstances. When Miguel saw the well-dressed man collapse, his first instinct was to run to his aid, just as his grandmother had taught him. "Señor, are you okay?" Miguel asked in accented English as he knelt beside Alexander, gently shaking his shoulder while checking for signs of consciousness. When Alexander's eyes flickered open briefly, Miguel could see the fear and confusion of a man who was experiencing something completely beyond his control. Without hesitation, Miguel pulled out his own phone, a basic model that his grandmother had bought him for emergencies, and dialed 911. While waiting for emergency services to arrive, Miguel stayed by Alexander's side, using his small hands to loosen the expensive tie that was constricting the older man's breathing and positioning him in the recovery position he had learned in a basic first aid class at school. Miguel talked to Alexander continuously, his young voice providing a calm presence in what could have been the final moments of the billionaire's life. "Help is coming, señor. Just breathe. You're going to be okay," Miguel repeated, his words carrying the kind of genuine concern that Alexander hadn't heard directed toward him in decades. As sirens approached and paramedics took over Alexander's care, Miguel quietly stepped back into the crowd, satisfied that he had done what his grandmother would have expected of him, and never imagining that his simple act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. Chapter 4. The Hospital Awakening. Alexander Sterling woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit of Northwestern Memorial Hospital 3 days after his heart attack, connected to machines that monitored every beat of the heart that had nearly killed him. The first emotion he experienced upon regaining consciousness wasn't relief at surviving or gratitude for the medical care that had saved his life. It was confusion about why he was still alive at all. His memories of the collapse were fragmented, but he clearly remembered lying on the sidewalk while dozens of people walked past him as if he were invisible. The attending cardiologist, Dr. Rachel Morrison, explained that Alexander had suffered a massive heart attack that could have been fatal if not for the quick thinking of a young boy who had called for help and provided basic first aid until paramedics arrived. "You're lucky that kid knew what to do, Doctor," Morrison told him during her morning rounds. "He probably saved your life by keeping you calm and positioned correctly. Most adults would have panicked or tried to move you, which could have made things much worse." Alexander found himself obsessing over the identity of this mysterious boy who had helped him when no one else would. Through his security team and private investigators, he learned that the Good Samaritan was Miguel Santos, a 12-year-old who lived with his grandmother in a modest apartment building that Alexander's own real estate company had been trying to purchase and demolish for the past 2 years as part of a luxury development project. The irony was staggering. The child who had saved his life was living in a building that Alexander was actively working to destroy for profit. Miguel's grandmother, Maria Santos, was one of the elderly tenants who had been resisting Alexander's aggressive buyout offers, choosing to fight for her home rather than accept what she considered inadequate compensation for the place where she had lived for over 2 decades. As Alexander lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by the most advanced medical technology that money could buy, he couldn't stop thinking about a 12-year-old boy who had shown him more genuine kindness in 5 minutes than he had experienced from colleagues, employees, and business associates in years of professional relationships. Chapter 5. The Investigation. During his week-long hospital stay, Alexander used his resources to learn everything he could about Miguel Santos and his grandmother Maria. What he discovered challenged every assumption he had made about the people his business decisions affected. Miguel was an honor student at a local middle school who worked part-time at a grocery store to help his grandmother pay rent and medical bills. His academic records showed exceptional performance, despite the challenges of being raised by an elderly woman on a fixed income in a neighborhood that Alexander's own development projects were systematically gentrifying. Maria Santos had worked as a seamstress for 40 years, saving every penny to buy the small apartment that was now worth far more than she had paid for it, but not enough to relocate anywhere comparable in the Chicago area. The building that Alexander wanted to demolish wasn't just an investment property. It was home to 12 families who had built a community together over decades of shared struggles and mutual support. Alexander's investigators provided detailed reports about each tenant, including their employment histories, family situations, and financial circumstances. These weren't abstract numbers on a spreadsheet or obstacles to profit maximization. They were real people with complex lives, dreams, and relationships that gave meaning to their existence. Miguel's story was particularly compelling. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 8, leaving him in the care of his grandmother, who had sacrificed her own comfort to ensure he had opportunities for education and advancement. The boy worked not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to contribute to the household and help ensure that his grandmother could afford her medications and the physical therapy she needed for her arthritis. Miguel's teacher had written recommendation letters describing him as the kind of student who helped struggling classmates with their homework, volunteered for community service projects, and showed leadership qualities that suggested a bright future if he could access educational opportunities. Reading these reports from his hospital bed, Alexander realized that his business decision to demolish this building would destroy not just 12 units of affordable housing, but an entire support network that had taken decades to build and might never be recreated elsewhere. Chapter 6. The Moral Reckoning. As Alexander's physical condition stabilized and he prepared for discharge from the hospital, he found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in decades: genuine moral uncertainty about a business decision. His legal team and development managers were pressuring him to finalize the building acquisition while he was recovering, arguing that delays would increase costs and potentially allow other developers to interfere with the project. From a purely financial perspective, the luxury condo development would generate enormous profits and add significant value to Alexander's real estate portfolio. The neighborhood was rapidly gentrifying, property values were rising, and the building's current tenants were simply obstacles to be overcome through legal and financial pressure. But every time Alexander tried to focus on the numbers and strategic benefits of the development, he found himself thinking about Miguel Santos kneeling beside him on the sidewalk, providing comfort and assistance when dozens of other people had simply walked away. The boy who had potentially saved his life was living in a building that Alexander was planning to destroy, and the moral implications of that coincidence were impossible to ignore. Alexander's worldview had always been based on the premise that business and personal feelings were completely separate realms, and that successful people made decisions based on logic and profit rather than sentiment and emotion. But lying in a hospital bed, dependent on machines and medications to keep him alive, Alexander was forced to confront the possibility that his entire philosophy might be fundamentally flawed. Miguel's act of kindness hadn't been motivated by potential profit or strategic advantage. It had been a pure expression of human compassion that asked nothing in return. The boy hadn't known who Alexander was or what he could offer in exchange for his help. He had simply seen another human being in distress and responded with immediate generosity. Alexander began to wonder what kind of world he had been creating through his business practices, and whether the accumulation of wealth and power was worth the cost of becoming someone who inspired fear rather than respect, who commanded obedience rather than loyalty, and who had isolated himself so completely from human connection that a child's kindness felt like a revelation. Chapter 7. The Decision That Changed Everything. On the morning of his discharge from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Alexander Sterling made a decision that would shock his legal team, baffle his business associates, and transform his relationship with both Miguel Santos and the entire Santos family. Instead of proceeding with the building demolition as planned, Alexander instructed his real estate division to cancel the development project entirely and to remove the building from any future acquisition lists. The financial cost of this decision was substantial. His company had already invested over $2 million in planning, legal fees, and preliminary construction contracts. But Alexander had concluded that some things were more valuable than money. His lawyers and development managers tried desperately to change his mind, presenting detailed financial projections that showed how much profit the company would lose by abandoning the project. They argued that business decisions shouldn't be influenced by personal sentimentality, and that his shareholders and business partners would view this choice as evidence of impaired judgment following his medical crisis. But Alexander had made his decision with the same decisive authority that had characterized his most successful business ventures, and no amount of financial analysis could change his mind about what he now saw as a moral obligation rather than a business opportunity. However, Alexander's transformation went far beyond simply canceling one development project. He began to view his vast real estate holdings through an entirely different lens, looking for ways to balance profit with social responsibility and community preservation. His next decision was even more unprecedented. He would personally visit Miguel Santos and his grandmother to thank them for their help and to inform them about the cancelled demolition. This would be the first time in decades that Alexander had voluntarily entered a neighborhood that he hadn't gentrified, a building that he didn't own, or a social situation where his wealth and power couldn't protect him from genuine human interaction. The prospect of meeting Miguel again, this time as a conscious and grateful beneficiary of the boy's kindness rather than an unconscious victim of a medical emergency, was both exciting and terrifying for a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of personal connection with the people affected by his business decisions. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Visit. 3 days after being discharged from the hospital, Alexander Sterling did something that shocked his security team and personal assistants. He drove himself to Miguel Santos's neighborhood in a modest sedan rather than his usual armored limousine. He wanted this visit to be as normal and non-threatening as possible, understanding instinctively that arriving with bodyguards and expensive vehicles would create exactly the kind of power imbalance that had defined all of his previous interactions with people of different social and economic backgrounds. The building where Miguel and his grandmother lived was a 3-story brick structure built in the 1940s, showing its age but maintained with obvious care and pride by residents who treated it as a real home rather than just temporary housing. Alexander climbed the stairs to apartment 2B, his heart racing not from physical exertion, but from the unfamiliar experience of approaching someone who had no reason to fear him, want anything from him, or treat him with the calculated deference that characterized most of his social interactions. When Maria Santos opened her door and saw Alexander standing in the hallway, her first reaction was confusion rather than recognition. She knew that a wealthy developer had been trying to buy their building, but she had never seen Alexander in person and couldn't immediately connect this casually dressed man with the corporate entity that had been pressuring the tenants to sell their homes. "Mrs. Santos," Alexander said carefully, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority that had intimidated boardrooms for decades. "My name is Alexander Sterling. I believe your grandson Miguel helped me last week when I had a medical emergency downtown." Maria's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, and then to the kind of warm concern that had characterized her approach to community relationships for decades. "Oh, see, Miguel told me about helping a man who collapsed. Please come in. How are you feeling? Are you okay now?" Her genuine worry about his health, coming from someone who had every reason to view him as an enemy, was almost overwhelming for Alexander. As he entered the modest apartment, Alexander was struck by how much love and care had been invested in creating a comfortable home with limited resources. The furniture was old but well maintained. Family photographs covered every available surface, and the smell of homemade cooking filled the air with warmth that his sterile penthouse had never possessed. Chapter 9. The Heartfelt Conversation. Miguel was doing homework at the kitchen table when Alexander entered the apartment, and the boy's face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing the man he had helped was recovered and healthy. "You look much better, senor," Miguel said with the unconscious honesty of someone too young to filter his observations through social expectations. "I was worried about you. My grandmother always says we should help people when they're in trouble, but I wasn't sure if I did everything right." Alexander found himself sitting at the same kitchen table where Miguel completed his schoolwork, sharing coffee and homemade cookies with Maria while explaining how the boy's quick thinking and first aid had potentially saved his life. The conversation that followed was unlike any that Alexander had experienced in decades of business meetings, social events, and professional negotiations. There were no hidden agendas, strategic positioning, or calculated exchanges of information designed to gain advantage over the other party. Maria and Miguel were simply interested in Alexander as a human being who had survived a frightening medical emergency, and they shared their own stories about health challenges, community support, and the importance of helping neighbors during difficult times. When the conversation naturally turned to the building and the development pressure that residents had been experiencing, Alexander took a deep breath and prepared to share news that he hoped would begin to repair some of the damage his business practices had caused to this community. "Mrs. Santos," he said carefully, "I need to tell you something important. The company that has been trying to buy this building, that's my company. I'm the developer who has been pressuring you and your neighbors to sell your homes." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that Alexander couldn't predict or control. Maria's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and what might have been disappointment or anger. Miguel looked back and forth between his grandmother and Alexander, trying to understand the significance of this revelation. "But I want you to know," Alexander continued quickly, "that I've decided to cancel the entire project. Your building is safe. No one will be forced to move, and there will be no more pressure to sell. I realize that some things are more important than profit, and this community is one of those things." Chapter 10. The transformation begins. The impact of Alexander's announcement on Maria and Miguel was immediate and profound, but their reaction was not what he had expected. Instead of celebrating or expressing gratitude for his decision to spare their building, Maria studied his face with the kind of penetrating wisdom that comes from decades of evaluating people's true motivations and character. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you give up so much money to help people you don't even know?" Her question forced Alexander to articulate something he was still trying to understand himself. How a brief encounter with genuine human kindness had revealed the emptiness of a life dedicated solely to the accumulation of wealth and power. He explained how Miguel's selfless assistance during his medical emergency had reminded him of values his own grandmother had tried to teach him 50 years earlier, before ambition and success had gradually eroded his capacity for compassion and community connection. As Alexander talked about his isolated life in the penthouse, his failed relationships, and his growing realization that fear and money were poor substitutes for respect and genuine human connection, Maria began to see past his expensive clothes and powerful reputation to the lonely and disconnected person he had become. Miguel, with the instinctive emotional intelligence of someone raised in a loving environment, seemed to understand that Alexander needed their friendship more than they needed his money. "You could come visit us sometimes," Miguel offered with characteristic generosity. "My grandmother makes really good food, and I could show you the community garden we have on the roof. It's not fancy, but it's nice." Alexander found himself accepting this invitation with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. Over the following weeks, these visits became a regular part of his schedule, providing him with the kind of authentic human interaction he had been missing for decades. He helped Miguel with homework, listened to Maria's stories about immigration and community building, and began to understand how much his business practices had damaged neighborhoods and displaced families throughout Chicago. These conversations gradually inspired Alexander to apply the same values that had motivated his decision about the Santos building to other aspects of his business empire, beginning a transformation that would eventually affect thousands of employees and community members throughout the region. Chapter 11, The Ripple Effect. 6 months after his heart attack and his first visit to the Santos apartment, Alexander Sterling had become a completely different kind of businessman and a completely different kind of person. The transformation began with small changes in how he treated employees and conducted business negotiations, but it gradually expanded into a comprehensive re-examination of his entire approach to wealth, power, and social responsibility. Alexander established a foundation focused on affordable housing preservation, ensuring that other communities wouldn't face the displacement pressure that had threatened Miguel's neighborhood. He also implemented comprehensive healthcare benefits for all employees in his companies, remembering how his own medical emergency had made him dependent on the kindness of others. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alexander's personal life, where he had developed genuine friendships and family-like relationships that gave his existence meaning beyond financial success. Miguel had become like a grandson to him, and Alexander found himself attending school events, helping with college planning, and providing mentorship that was based on care and affection rather than business strategy. Maria had become his trusted advisor on community issues, helping him understand how development projects affected real families and neighborhoods. When Alexander received an award from the Chicago Chamber of Commerce for his contributions to affordable housing and community development, he brought Miguel and Maria as his guests, proudly introducing them as the people who had taught him what true success actually meant. The local news coverage of Alexander's transformation from ruthless developer to community advocate included interviews with Miguel, who explained with remarkable maturity how helping someone in need had created a friendship that changed both of their lives. "I just did what my grandmother taught me," Miguel said during the interview. But Mr. Alexander did something much harder. He changed his whole life to become a better person. As Alexander reflected on the year since his heart attack, he realized that collapsing on a Chicago sidewalk had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. Not because it had taught him about his own mortality, but because it had connected him with people who had shown him how to live with purpose, compassion, and genuine human connection. The SUV that had showed up the next day hadn't brought material gifts or financial rewards. It had brought Alexander Sterling to a community that had welcomed him not as a powerful billionaire, but as a neighbor who needed to learn the difference between success and significance.